Long gone have the times of Robert De Niro looking out over sprawling Los Angeles at night in heat and us actually being able to see everything. Hi guys, it's Debbie, and after a long time of complaining about films either being just a pitch black or grey, or having this very bland, boring, beige, grey, colourless palette that gives no depth whatsoever to films. A few days ago I watched a film which really was a blessing for my eyes, and that was I Love Boosters, which before watching it I thought had something to do with COVID or vaccines, as in I'm getting my booster, something like that. I had no clue that the word booster was like slang for shoplifters. Anyway, to be honest, in this world in which people just want quantity over substance and watch movies while on their phones, I can kind of understand why studios such as Netflix don't even bother. They just give them the blandest content possible and they're fine with it. This affects scripts with constant over exposition so that people can do things while they're watching the films because everything will be explained in the background. It affects editing. Now everything's fast paced because the attention span is so low. It affects cinematography with images framed dead center so they can easily be cropped vertically. The same goes for movie logos, which are now often vertically spaced, and scenes that clearly feel written just to be cropped vertically for promotional videos. And of course this is just a rinse and repeat because apparently we need an insane amount of new movies and series every week. So of course if you're just interested in pumping out content as fast as possible, the highest number possible, you're not going to care about investing in good color grading and cinematography, even if you know that your customers are watching on progressively smaller screens. Sometimes I don't even understand the choice. For example, the new movie Evil Dead Burn comes from a line of highly successful, well-performing movies, yet most of it is completely grey and flat, probably because they had to cover up and colour match a huge amount of effects and prosthetics, which is a pity because that's usually something relegated to lower budget horror films like, I don't know, The Ritual with Al Pacino.
She is touched by something.
I understand it's set at night, but take a look at how Jordan Peele managed to light Nope, even though it's also set at night and basically in the middle of the desert, or more recently 28 years later The Bone Temple. Of course there are still people who care about this, we'll get to I Love Boosters in a moment, but there are various other recent examples. Began's Resurrection opens with very dark scenes, but they used to highlight a dystopian, ruined world and the protagonist's deteriorating mind, only to then showcase the complete opposite as soon as the protagonist begins unraveling memories from before that darkness. Suddenly we're in awe of the colours and vibrancy. Obsession also made a good use of darkness, as the protagonist is often scared of his partner as she tends to scuttle around at night. She's lurking in the dark. We get creative scenes involving only her eyes emerging from the darkness, something we'd already seen with the glimmers in Sinners. There was intentionality behind it. The same goes for Frankenstein. Even in the middle of pouring rain, violent storms, and the cluttered scientist's room at night, we could still clearly see everything with such vivid intensity. Kokuo had such vibrant contrasting colours that I generally felt like I was sitting inside the theatre watching the actors perform directly in front of me. Project Hail Mary has one of the most beautiful sequences drenched in colours. Wuthering Heights, with all its flaws, at least manages to drape the rooms of its mansion in such peculiar furniture, wallpaper, textures and colours that you feel like you're walking around inside a dollhouse. I don't think I was ever struggling to figure out what I was looking at in one battle after another. The Bride creatively uses pops of colour like the bride's orange dress and the contrast between the black stain on her face and her pale skin. I think in general we're moving horror away from relying so heavily on darkness. Backrooms, for example, is mostly well lit. I think Midsommar was the film that made people go, okay, we can actually do this in mainstream horror. I don't want to go on forever, but for every one of these movies, I can give you a never-ending list of this mush, this grey, dark, boring palette, flat, lifeless images that convey nothing, no depth, no emotion. Some recent offenders are The Woman in Cabin 10, the new Devil Wears Prada movie, long stretches of Mother Mary, Matt Damon and Ben Affleck talking in the dark in the rear, After the Hunt, My Oxford Year, which is just brown and grey. So when I watched I Love Boosters just a few days ago, my eyes were so happy, and the director said he wanted to recreate that fun, rambunctious movie-going experience he could remember from his childhood. In the world in which the movie is set, Demi Moore plays a stinking rich, snobbish fashion designer who owns a chain of clothing stores, each with their own specific colour theme. Everybody dresses in that colour, has matching coloured hair, glasses, everything. So already we're starting off with that. The protagonists are a group of friends who team up to steal from these shops to then they are the boosters, to then resell the clothes. But they do it in the most over-the-top ways imaginable, elaborate plans, fancy outfits, and the more they get involved in all of this, the more absurd the story becomes. Crazy characters are added along the way, secondary storylines keep piling on, and it's just also over-the-top, creative, and ridiculous in a good way. Now you might say, well, it's easy to get pieces of everything you could possibly come up with and just mix and match and paste everything together and pass it off as something curated and not focusing on the actual story. But although the movie is absurdist, it's not the first time the director has taken this path. He's already done it with Sorry to Bother You. It doesn't just throw a bunch of nonsensical things at you to distract from the fact that it doesn't have a solid story. Now, it does get a bit out of hand towards the end, but it definitely doesn't lack an interesting story. And in the midst of all the craziest things you see, the movie makes sure you pay attention to specific quotes that make a whole scene, or remember specific details that will then be useful much later in the story. The way in which colour was incorporated in the film is very intentional. There's actually a very interesting video that director Boots Riley did in which he explains the whole process from his thoughts onto the screen along with other members of the crew. For example, the cinematographer explains how every time we see black on the screen, it's not totally black, it's always contaminated with colour to create depth and texture. I would recommend watching that video in general, as it explains a lot about the use of anamorphic lenses, the production design, and other interesting behind the scenes information. Now, I'm talking a lot about the movie's colours, but in reality its maximalism also comes from the non-stop parade of famous faces you keep running into, the crazy sets, like Demi Moore's apartment, which has like a slanted architecture, the visual metaphors that appear throughout the film, and an absolutely bonkers sex scene, which I will leave to you to discover. And in addition to all of that creativity, it doesn't overpower its core anti-capitalist message, which starts off as a sort of funny Robin Hood story, but which then becomes progressively more serious as the story evolves and the protagonists realize what they're actually up against. We can genuinely relate to the protagonist's personal stories and concerns, even if they're exaggerated to the extreme on screen. For example, the movie heavily touches on wealth disparity, the classism people develop, creativity being exploited and copied by those higher up, and in general, let's say, the struggles of the working class. Obviously, it's all presented through a strong comedic lens with skits about everything from how bad their lunch break is to how nasty their boss is. I mean, Boots Riley had already explored these ideas, again through a very comedic lens, in his previous movie, Sorry to Bother You, where Lakeith Stanfield is basically living in a garage, driving a broken down car, owning people money, and working as a telemarketer before everything spirals into a much crazier adventure. I still remember some of you a few years ago watching it because I'd recommended it, saying, thank goodness I didn't read anything about this movie before watching it. And in his personal life, Boots Riley is much more directly involved in grassroots activism. He's spoken about people needing to organise within their workplaces, so this has clearly been a recurrent topic for him. At the same time, I read of people accusing him of making anti-capitalist art, but through the use of funds from evil corporations. His response has basically been that there are no good corporations and that the important thing is getting the movie made. Other people argue that his views and his message haven't changed regardless of where the funding comes from, and that if you want your work to actually be seen nowadays, at some point you have to engage with capitalism. To be honest, I'm not well informed about his life and career beyond these two films, so if you have any useful information, feel free to share it in the comments below. I'm also curious to know what you think of his series I'm a Virgo, because I haven't seen it yet and I would love to hear about that. And of course, I'd love to hear what you think about I Love Boosters. Did you like the movie? And if you haven't seen it, does it sound like something interesting? Let me know everything in the comments down below. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, feel free to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.